the fevered swamps are now like they're wading into their necks. Let's bring in Republican presidential candidate, former New Jersey Governor Christie. Just came back from Ukraine, where he met with President Zelensky. Hey, Chris, Governor, whatever I'm supposed to call you. So I've spoken with Vivek early on. Nice guy, seems to be a really smart guy. And we talked about him coming on the show early on. Maybe I'll have him on the show. But his statements keep getting more bizarre by the day. He talks about defunding the FBI. He says stupid stuff like this. And you know, it's more, I think it's a reflection on him, of course, but it's a reflection on just how crazy a lot of these Republican candidates think they have to be to win the votes of the base. Like, what's going on out there when he's having to say this? And by the way, for the record, there's a guy that I don't think voted Republican until 2020, and he wrote in his book that Donald Trump behaved abhorrently after January the 6th. That's all changed in a couple of years.
Well, good morning, Joe and Mika. Good to see you. And yep. Look, I don't take the stuff that he says seriously. You know, the fact is, this is a very, very ambitious guy who is basically playing the role so far in this race as, you know, Donald Trump's wingman, and you know, that's his call. I don't think. But
Governor, isn't he hearing that from the audience? You and I both know we've seen politicians that basically, instead of telling people what they need to hear, they're basically a mirror of the audience. He wouldn't be saying that unless he was hearing it, right?
Well, I'm sure he's hearing it certainly from some elements of the party, but I don't think it's a majority of the party. It certainly has not been my experience. I'm heading up to New Hampshire later today. I could tell you the last time I was up there a couple of weeks ago, we heard a lot of support. 2/3 of the audience that I had was very supportive of my position on Ukraine, which is that we haven't done enough. And that while, I think that President Biden has certainly done better than President Trump, and President Trump did better than President Obama on this, we still have more to go. And having gone over there now, Joe and Mika, and watched for myself what the folks in Ukraine are going through, what they've already gone through. The idea that this is something that America does not have a vital interest in, to me, is just absurd. Not only because we should be standing up against a barbaric Russian administration that is doing things like the gouging of eyes, the cutting off of ears of men in Ukraine before they tie their hands behind their back and shoot them in the back of the head, and then go into those homes where they've just taken these men out of and raped the women. Nearly 20,000 children have been kidnapped from Ukraine, brought to Russia to be separated from their families, programmed to be anti-Ukrainian, and to work for the Russian Federation. I met with some of those parents, guys, and I could tell you as a dad, it's unimaginable to me that your child would be yanked away from you. You don't know whether they're dead or alive, whether they're being cared for or abused. These are the things that Vladimir Putin is imposing upon Ukraine. And this is the guy that Donald Trump says is brilliant and a great leader. Well, if that's brilliant leadership, you can keep it. It isn't that. Well, it's barbarism.
It's barbarism. He's also a guy that set back his own country, probably a generation, exposed his military as being extraordinarily weak. So make the argument, if you will, about why the United States needs to continue supporting Ukraine. And you talked about the human rights element of it, but geopolitically, what does the world look like if the United States and Europe, NATO, let Vladimir Putin just take over a sovereign country that we actually had treaties with saying would protect their territorial integrity? What happens? And then what happens next in Taiwan? And then what happens next in the Middle East with Iran? What happens if we send a message to the world, hey, we're going to let the worst regimes on the planet invade countries next door to them?
Well, you started to answer the question for me. I'll finish the answer. Russia-Ukraine is the undercard. It's the undercard because the Chinese, who are funding the Russian aggression against Ukraine, are watching. And if we cut and run on Ukraine, the next fight is going to be in Taiwan. And there, it's not going to be us just supplying weapons. It's going to be American men and women who are going to be sent 3/4 of the way around the world to fight there. And they're going to have to fight there not only to protect the freedom of Taiwan, but for those who don't care about that, be practical. 2/3 of the world's semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. Everything that runs our cell phones, our computers, our automobiles, and just about every other element of American life now will be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think that's a place that we want to be in from a practical economic or technological perspective. And when you look at what's happening here, then go to the Middle East. The Iranians are obviously coordinating with the Russians and the Chinese to provide more sophisticated weaponry to the Russians. And the folks in the Middle East, whether it's the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, are all going to look at this and say, it's not worth it to be friends with the United States anymore. We might as well cut the best deal we can with the Chinese, because when things get tough, Americans run the other way. One of the points of my campaign, guys, is that America has never been great by being small. And right now, in elements of my party and in the elements, some elements of the Democratic Party, we are arguing over what I consider to be small issues. They're not unimportant, but they're small. The big issues that we have to deal with, and one of them is American leadership around the world. Those issues are what makes America bigger, stronger, richer, freer. And every time, going all the way back to 1776, the Civil War, World War II, and the Cold War, ending in the Reagan era, when we had presidents who said, we're going to make some sacrifices and we're going to go big, we always came out on top. We had a country after the revolution. We had a united country free of slavery after the Civil War.
Right.
We protected a free Europe and a free rest of the world and became the leader of the world after the World War II. And Reagan, in 9 years, took down the Berlin Wall and in 10 years eliminated the Soviet Union from the face of the earth. That's the kind of thing we should be doing. And the Ukraine fight, Joe, is the undercard. If we do it right, there won't be another fight.
Agree.
If we do it wrong,
I completely agree.
Not going to be good.
And if Biden had not worked with Republican allies, strong Republican allies in the Senate especially, and with strong allies in NATO, to do this, then of course you would have some of the same people saying the reason Taiwan was invaded by China was because the United States didn't defend Ukraine. So yeah, they're being hypocrites. Mika, it's almost like when you hear Governor Christie say that we need to focus on big things instead of some of these small distractions. It's almost like he's saying America's standing in the world, America's role in the world is more important than Bud Light or Mickey Mouse. Yeah, or woke, whatever that means for Republicans who just use the word randomly up and down in elections. I think the Yankees are woke. I just said it. They're definitely so woke. You just throw it around any way you like. Chris, do you, I mean, it's sort of leading, but I want to get to how we got here. In the 3 indictments against him, the ongoing legal suits, the potential 4th indictment coming his way, is it your belief that Donald Trump probably committed a crime or two? Oh, yeah. He certainly committed crimes in the classified documents case. I believe the keeping of those documents was a crime, and the obstruction was clearly a crime. You know, and now the superseding indictment where he was ordering folks allegedly to delete the surveillance cameras. You know, it reminded me of like what maybe Abbott and Costello meets the Corleones would have looked like. You know, all of a sudden now you're sending Fredo, Walton Auta as Fredo, down there to eliminate the server. I mean, this is both criminal and completely stupid, which is the combination that Donald Trump is bringing to the country, is the combination of criminality and abject stupidity, both in terms of his comments and in terms of his actions. And now when you look at the January 6th stuff, look, you guys know, I did this work for 7 years
at the 5th largest office in the country, in New Jersey. And it's an aggressive indictment, the January 6th indictment. I think there are more legal issues raised in the January 6th indictment than in the classified documents indictment, which I think is a pretty clean, clear, and not really assailable from a legal perspective. There are going to be some interesting legal judgments to make in the January 6th case. But my point to folks in our party is, yes, we should care about those things, and the judges should make these decisions and decide what's legal and what isn't for the prosecutors to be doing. But the bigger question for us is the underlying conduct. Whether you believe what Donald Trump did on January 6th was criminal or not, it was immoral. He invited these people to Washington, D.C., telling them it was going to be wild. He then lied to them in front of them that day, saying that the election had been stolen when it hadn't, and lied to them and said it was all up to Mike Pence, and Mike Pence could reverse this if he wanted to, if he had the courage to. Then he told them to march up to Capitol Hill and that he would march with them. Now, you guys have known him for almost as long as I have, and you know that if there was a risk that Donald Trump was going to break a fingernail, he wasn't going up to Capitol Hill. And so he went back into the safety of the White House, sent these people up there to try to intimidate Mike Pence and members of Congress into not doing their job and certifying the election. And then, to me, the capper was even worse. He sat in that dining room off the Oval Office, eating his well-done hamburger and watching on TV as people laid waste to the United States Capitol. And he did nothing, despite even members of his own family urging him to get out there on TV and put an end to it. I don't know, guys, if that makes you criminally responsible, but I know it makes you morally responsible. And is that the kind of person we want sitting behind the desk in the Oval Office? I'm running. That's a great, because the answer to that is no. Absolutely not.
So that's a great question, and I agree. My follow-up question, and it's meant with real curiosity, from having served in the White House, from covered it, we're all sort of watching what has happened to our country. How do you think we got here? What was it about him and the way he worked it in the White House, from your perspective, that gets us to a point where right now it's almost standing out that we can have an honest conversation about January 6th and the fact that this man probably committed multiple crimes? And yet you talk to Republican leaders, you talk to Kevin McCarthy, and it's honestly like a Jordan Klepper clip. It's honestly like you're talking to someone who's like, well, but you know, Hillary Clinton did that. What has happened that actually there are so many Republicans that you have to go talk to people in New Hampshire and in other places that Trump won, and you have to almost beg them to be reasonable and to remember, like, what a moral compass looks like. Right. What happened?
And by the way, Governor, let me just add, Mika, though she didn't say it in the question, Mika believes this didn't start with Donald Trump. That this is like a 25-year progression.
But I want to know what made it fast forward in the White House.
What accelerated this?
Yeah, look, I think it is important to note that a lot of folks have felt over time, over the last number of administrations, that they've been ignored and left out and mistreated. And so there was an anger in the country that Donald Trump tapped into in 2016 that was the creation of both parties. We need to acknowledge that and understand that when things went sideways in Iraq under George W. Bush, there were people who were very angry, upset, and felt disenfranchised by that. When Barack Obama said, you know, if you like your doctor, you can keep him. If you like your health plan, you can keep him. And that turned out to be untrue. That made people even more cynical towards their government. And then Donald Trump raised that cynicism to an entirely new level during his presidency. And now Joe Biden, by promising the country when he was running that he was going to be a moderate who was going to govern from the middle and bring people together, and a lot of people, a lot of Republicans who were discontent with Trump, and a lot of independents who had voted for Trump in 2016, went ahead and took a chance on Biden, and they're now disillusioned, and the polls show that they're disillusioned with President Biden. So first, I think it's important to note that there are a number of people who contributed mightily to this problem in addition to Donald Trump. The problem with Donald Trump is that he knows no sense of history, has no intellectual curiosity, and doesn't care whether he puts himself before the country at every turn. So when he sits now, Mika, and says, well, I'm getting indicted for you, it is so patently absurd. Not only because all the conduct he's getting indicted for were things he didn't have to do and he chose himself to do, had nothing to do with protecting the American people. How are the American people benefited by him keeping boxes of classified documents in Mar-a-Lago? That was there, and you guys know this. He was there just for him to continue to pretend he was president and show off for people who were on the back patio at Mar-a-Lago by showing them things he shouldn't have been showing them. And so he's not putting America first. That's the great irony of this campaign is Donald Trump saying he's going to put America first. He has not put America first. He's put Donald Trump first. And I do believe, and you know, there was a poll that just came out this weekend in New Hampshire, which has Donald Trump now down to 34% in New Hampshire. Now, Ron DeSantis at 13, I'm at 11. So we're still behind him. But he's down 14 points from where he was. And when you think about it, guys, that means that 2/3 of the Republicans polled in New Hampshire are against Donald Trump, the incumbent president, who, you know, for practical purposes, he's the incumbent in the Republican Party. 2/3 are against him. So I do not share the skepticism and the fatalism that everybody else does. I believe his conduct, which is being exposed, will make a difference.
Yeah. If I can interrupt here just to say and pass it to Reverend Al, I've seen quite a few polls, Reverend Al, that had Governor Christie in double digits in New Hampshire. It is early, but there are a lot of people that have been running for president for quite some time that have been more high profile than Governor Christie before his launch that are still at 2 or 3%. So we still have a race in New Hampshire, and I think he's right. I think we still have a race, and you know this better than anybody. Presidential campaign, very fluid.
Very fluid. Let me ask you a two-part question, Governor. You and I may disagree on many, if not most, issues, but we always respected the institutions of government and what the country said it stood for, even if we didn't believe it lived up to it. When you see a sitting president undermine an election, which is undermining American democracy, I mean, no president in the history of this country ever did that. I mean, the founding fathers fought a revolution against Great Britain, not against the United States. He's telling the vice president to undermine the very tenets of what the country was founded for, democracy. How do you reconcile that members of your party and some of your opponents refuse to attack a man who's trying to undermine what the country stands for? It's un-American, aside from being criminal and immoral. It's un-American in terms of the concept. Secondly, how do we deal with the question of race in your party, of reaching out to people in the black community and other communities that feel isolated when you have a candidate that's trying to erase black history in Florida, the people that are against affirmative action, less known reparations where I am. You as governor, you and I debated, disagreed, but you never were disagreeable. I'm getting ready to eulogize Lieutenant Governor Oliver, who was a firm Democrat, but got along with you. Yeah. You came and sat at Whitney Houston's funeral, the great pop star, and people got concerned. He's sitting there with Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson. You never were disagreeable, even though you and I would fight. Both of us accused as being loudmouths on both sides. I don't know where they got that out.
Me neither.
But how do you deal with race, and how do you deal with the undermining of American institutions?
Well, let's start with your first part. That was the breaking point for me, Al. Election night 2020, when I was on ABC doing commentary, and when Donald Trump came out at 2:30 in the morning and said the election had been stolen, when I knew that he had absolutely no factual basis to make that judgment, and it was just all ego, the thing that affected me the most was, here's a man, President of the United States, standing behind the seal of the president in the East Room of the White House, telling the American people the election had been stolen, when he knew that could not be supported at that moment. And people are going to watch that, as you know, and believe, well, the president must know something that I don't know. And that disease still exists today. that so many people in my party believe the election was stolen. I cannot reconcile, and nor am I trying to reconcile, either what he did or what others in my party are doing now, but not speaking out against it. Because I don't think leaders interpret polls or follow them out. I think they change them. And so my campaign is about going out there and telling the truth and saying to people, like, look, it didn't happen. Okay, it didn't happen. His ego was damaged, and he couldn't deal with the fact that he's the only person outside the state of Delaware to have ever lost to Joe Biden. I can understand that must be like a killing thing to you, because Joe Biden ran for president 3 times and lost all 3 times. But the truth is the truth, and when you put yourself out there as a candidate, you got to be willing to accept the result, whether you like it or not. And he wouldn't, and not only did he not accept it, but he damaged the country in the process of not accepting it. On the issue of race, as you know, New Jersey is the most ethnically diverse state in America, both in terms of race and in terms of ethnicities in our state. And as the governor, I was proud to be the governor of a state like that, where I wanted to campaign and work in places where Republicans normally didn't. You know, you mentioned Cory Booker as well. Booker and I worked incredibly closely, and he's mayor of Newark, to try to reform schools there and to reform the police department, which needed help. We did the same thing in Camden when we fired the entire police department in the city, as you know, that was the most dangerous city in America, and yet 95% of color. And we fired the entire police department because we said, you're incompetent. And what's happened in the 10 years since then now? Murder rate in Camden, which was the most dangerous city in America, is down 75%. And when the George Floyd incident occurred, there was no violence in the city of Camden. In fact, the protest march was led by a pastor of the largest Baptist church in Camden and by the Polish-American white police chief, together marching against what happened to George Floyd. What I did as governor was to say, I don't care what your color is, I care what your ideas are. And as you know, as you mentioned, when you and I disagreed, I didn't disagree with you because you're an African-American. I disagreed with you because I thought you were wrong. And you did the same with me. And that's why when
you put some of my friends in jail, but we'll leave that alone.
Wait, hey, look, only because they deserved it, Al. They earned it. And, you know, that's why when I ran for re-election, I got 29% of the African-American vote. And for a Republican, that's rarefied air. And people would ask me why, and I said, because I listen to folks. And even when I disagree with them, they know I respect them. What Ron DeSantis and what's going on in Florida, saying that there's some benefit to slavery. Look, if I have to choose between in my party on this issue, siding with Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump, or with Tim Scott and Byron Donalds, I'll take Tim Scott and Byron Donalds. I think they understand the history of slavery and what it was a hell of a lot better than those 2 guys do, and better than I do. And I'd rather listen to Tim. And Tim's not, as you know, Tim's not an inflammatory guy. And for Tim to speak out as clearly as he did against this tells me how offensive it is for me historically, but more importantly to Tim, Byron, and members of the African-American community, how offensive it is morally to be saying these things. So I think you just have to tell the truth. And look, are there going to be some people in my party who don't support me for that reason? Absolutely. But I'm not looking to play to their weaknesses. I'm looking to play to America's strength.
Governor, when you were in Ukraine, you were there at the 18-month point of the war. Mm-hmm. The counteroffensive, quite honestly, is a slog. There's no breakthroughs. There was a powerful piece in the New York Times over the weekend by Roger Cohen about Putin's forever war. He is essentially gearing Russian society to fight this war, quote unquote, for as long as it takes. So even if the Biden administration were a bit quicker with F-16s or whatever, I don't know any serious military observer who thinks it would lead to a breakthrough. So you could have a situation where, imagine you were to win and you're the next president of the United States. What do you do? Do you basically say 3 more years, 5 more years? Do we continue to say it's up to Ukraine to decide what's good enough? Does the United States at some point work with Ukraine and say, hey, we need to find some way of bringing this war to end? In part, we've got to focus, among other things, on China and other issues in the world. What is your sense of what do we do if Ukraine cannot win this war militarily?
Well, from what I heard and saw this past week, Richard, I'm not nearly as skeptical as some of the experts are for this reason. I don't think most people know that right now on the average day in Ukraine, Russia is shooting 56,000 rounds of artillery into Ukraine and Ukraine is responding with about 6,500 rounds of artillery. That there are no F-16s, and the demining effort, as they're trying to do a counteroffensive, and the Russians have mined all the land that they've taken, is going to take time and needs more American support and technology to do that. We haven't sent F-16s, which I think has been an enormous mistake. Fair. And so I do think that what is in America's interest is to give Ukraine not just enough not to lose, but enough to try to win. Now, if we give them everything and in the amounts that are necessary to be competitive, we're not going to match Russian artillery, nor should we try to, but we got to do better than 11-1. And if we do that, and then the Ukrainians can't take back their disputed land, or most, if not all of it, well, then you're right. We do need to sit down with our allies, as you would with any ally, and say, okay, we think we've accomplished as much as you can accomplish. I know it's not fair that they have some of your land, but we have to put an end to this because it's not in anyone's interest to continue to have the slaughter of innocent soldiers and civilians in this war. But we're not there yet. And I think that Zelensky made the argument to me, I think pretty effectively, that if you give me everything that I need and I don't succeed, that's one thing. But if I'm getting outgunned 11-1 on artillery, and if I don't have F-16s to help even out the air warfare, then I got at least one hand tied behind my back. And I think to make a judgment to stop them would be the wrong judgment to make.
Republican presidential candidate Chris Christie, thank you very much for coming back on Morning Joe. Always good to see you.
Great to be back,
care.
Mika. Thanks for having me. I know you were the one who suggested this spot, and I can't thank you enough for persuading Joe to bring me on the show. I really can't. It's fabulous.
We'll get there. All
Always
right.
you
Thank
in my corner.
Chris.
I love it. Thank you.
It's us.
You
All
got
right,
it, baby.
still ahead
Right
on Morning. Say hi to Mary Pat.